So, welcome to the session, Planning for the Unknown, Managing the JSS, JDS, and Sites. I am Tom Larkin, a Senior Technical Account Manager at Jamf Software, based out of the Bay Area in California. And with me today is Andrew Seago from Genentech. And without further ado.
Thank you. So most important out of all this, thank all of you and thank Jamf Software for actually kicking this off every year. This year is amazing. I see so many new faces and so many old faces that have come back, and it's awesome for the community, and it's awesome to all come together. So thank you. So we're going straight into planning for the unknown. The idea behind that is not necessarily planning for disaster, but planning to get larger and planning for situations that might come up. I know, especially in the enterprise, your company might buy another company. You might double in size. There's a couple companies out there that have doubled or gone up by a third, hiring thousands of people. IT never knows. IT never knows until someone's already bought another business that you have to take over or support, or maybe it's the other way. And how can you set yourself up for success in those situations? So that's me. I've been working at Genentech for going on my 6th year, handling all the Casper and crash plan infrastructure, imaging, all those wonderful things. Was part of my own Casper 9 Beardathon, just up until coming here. So I want to just briefly, these are the topics we're going to go over. They're really, really broad, detailed topics. So we're trying to keep it with a good dialogue between me and you, so I'm not just yapping at you. So after each one of these topics, we're going to end up having a Q&A. Tom's going to run around with a mic, so make sure you have a question up there, then down there, then over there. So, the JSS. Depending on how familiar you are with the Casper suite, actually really understanding what the JSS is in itself and what part it plays, I wanted to make sure that we had kind of a clear understanding. What is the JSS? The JSS it's a web application. It's a web application that communicates with the database that all of your clients talk to. All of your mobile devices, all of your client devices, they all communicate to the JSS for their management, to run inventory, to policies. Every time you open any of the Casper apps, you're interacting with the JSS, right? If you open up self-service, you're talking to the JSS. If you open up Casper Remote, you have to talk to the JSS first, and then it talks to the database and gets all its settings. These are the core technologies that it's really based around. So you have MySQL, you have Tomcat, Java because of Tomcat, and then your core OS. So the restrictions are really quite broad. Anything that can run those technologies, you can run a JSS on. For supported frameworks, you have RHEL, Ubuntu, Windows, and of course, our favorite OS X server. So the JSS in itself, it's awesome, and you can have it all as one appliance if you wanted to. You could have MySQL, your database, your MySQL database, your distribution point, your JSS, and maybe if you only had a few hundred clients, that's perfectly fine. Maybe that's all you're ever going to need. Or maybe there's some reason that you need to add in some sort of redundancy, you need more speed, you need to try and make something more secure. Maybe you want to expose the JSS into the DMZ, but you don't want to have the web login so admins can try to get into your network from off network. You only want that internal. And that's where JSS clustering comes into play. So clustering the JSS is, on the top level, really, really, really simple. In actual practice and putting all the thought behind hitting the checkbox, there are things that you want to consider. But if you go into the JSS and you're down in system settings, there's a nice button for clustering. You just have to go in, click edit, go up there, hit the checkbox, and any JSSs that are already talking to your MySQL database, so regardless of what OS they're coming from, if they're given one single MySQL database to interact with and have the permission to do so, they're going to show up in here automatically. MySQL is going to show all the different JSSs that are talking to it at this time. In this scenario, we only have two. We have the local host because for slide purposes, it was running on the same system, MySQL. And then you have this second actual server. The important thing on all of this is the master. So it's not filled in here yet. And kind of an understanding of what the master does, the master JSS. Everybody else, they're just all, they're just web apps. They just interact with the MySQL database, the clients interact with it, and it's just going back and forth, shuffling data. The master JSS is the one that does all the housekeeping. It's the one that makes sure that the logs are flushed, keeps track of group membership, which is a major one, especially if you have a lot of smart groups. Your master JSS is going to be the one to do this. It's also the one that handles updating the database schema. So all these things actually take a little bit more overhead than just the other standard web apps. In my environment, I've made sure that my master has a good, decent amount of RAM, 16 gigs of RAM, dedicated box, nothing but rel and the JSS, and that's its purpose. It's not actually in what, I'll show you the cluster a little bit later, but it's not actually in the cluster, it's off to the side, and that's what admins interact with. You can't access it from the outside. All the other JSSs have no ability to log into them. Only this one, this is your reporting portal, your admin function. And this is actually the first kind of setup that we had as we were trying to grow and trying to get the most out of the hardware that we had at the time. We started separating out the roles. So like any organization, when you first start with Casper, unless you're already huge and have a lot of clients, you started with an all-in-one box. That one server was MySQL, JSS, distribution point. It was all the same thing, right? So as we got more and more clients and started using the JSS more and more self-service policies, more maintenance policies, more users running reports all the time, we needed to start separating out the roles. So in this situation, we took one server, essentially, and we divided it into 3 different servers. So that there was a web app server, and that was what all the clients were talking to. So all of the clients were managed by this one JSS and the DNS name that resolved to this JSS. Then there was the MySQL database. And then there was the actual admin console, or the master JSS. And that's the one that you would interact with for reporting when you're making policies. Any of the tasks that you would want to keep from interrupting with production. Right, so if you're running a huge report, in my case, one of them's applications. If I need to do a list of all the applications and all the application versions across 11,000 plus clients, that's a lot of data. And that does slow things up a bit, especially on the systems that the JSS that you're running it from. So this just allows you to separate that out. This is how you can get a little bit larger. So here's a better example of that DNS name that I was talking about before. It's an important thing out of clustering. Even though you could have, there's no limit to how many JSSs you could cluster together. The one limiting factor is that always, if you expect clients to speak to them, they all have to come back as one DNS name. Whether or not that's DNS round robin, wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but hey, it's better than nothing. Or a load balancer or a virtual IP. however you're going to do it, in the end, all of your clients need to be managed by, in this scenario, jss.acme.com. You're not going to have JSS internal 1, JSS internal 2, JSS internal 3. The end clients, they don't care. The Apple devices, whether it's iOS, a laptop, an iMac, they all just need to know one DNS name. Once you're behind that, each one of these servers, each one of these JSSs, they're talking to MySQL database. So in this situation, if server 3 goes down, we still have server 4, 1, and 2, and likewise, however it goes. Or maybe there's 100 clients running a really hard report or doing some task that's taking up a lot of resources. You'll actually be able to have more balance. So these servers don't have to be as high spec'd as maybe your master. They could be. That'd be awesome if you had those resources. In my scenario, I was able to bring these down, so these had 8 gigs of RAM, 4 cores, VMs, and separate them all out. The master has 16 gigs for all the different log purging and huge reports we have to do. And anytime we update the JSS, it's you have to have some serious hardware for us. And that's more of the real scenario of what I have in place right now. In my situation, it's multiple sites. So I have the fault tolerancy that should, in this situation, Minneapolis kind of fall off the face of this planet, I could restore a MySQL dump to Eau Claire and still have 2 JSSs up there responding back from my clients. Worst case scenario. But for the most part, everybody's going to go to Minneapolis in this scenario. It's all going to still be the jss.acme.com. They're all managed by the same thing. But the reason why they're all kind of in one geographical location in this is MySQL right there in the middle. That's really your biggest pain point is going to be how close your web apps are to MySQL. In my scenario, I'm managing Macs all over the world. And I'm here to tell you, there's not a lot of traffic that goes between a client and the JSS. That's not going to be your issue. You don't need I do not need JSSs all over the world. I need my JSSs to be right next to my MySQL database, preferably on the same network switch or the same VM cluster or however you're going to do it, just to speed up that interaction between the JSS and MySQL. The clients, they check in, they get their list of tasks, they go off, they do their other things, they talk to the distribution points, the JDSs. That's where all of your actual bandwidth and speed is going to be taken up. But if it takes a long time for the JSS to speak to MySQL, to update tables, and every time that it's doing an update to a table, it's locking that table so no one else can, just because of the standard framework of how out of the box MySQL is set up. So I think key takeaways from scaling / clustering the JSS, just wanted to share a few things that I've definitely learned over the years. Clustering can be all sizes for all reasons. There's no right answer on whether or not you need to have a cluster. You might, you may not. Maybe you have extra hardware. Maybe it'd be great for you. Maybe you're tired because your one JSS has some issues and you need to scale up. Maybe you're now on a hiring ramp up, or adoption within your company is getting much larger for Macs because of those pesky iOS devices, and now they want their own Mac. Always important that the clients can only be managed by one DNS name. So that's another gotcha that you have to keep in mind. Yes, you can scale as much as you want, but at the end of the day, all the clients need to be able to interact with the web apps through one single DNS name. Whether it's jss.acme.com, whatever you're going to name it, super secret portal, please don't go here, .com. That's what your clients need to be managed by. Definitely. So since all my web apps are in RHEL, because I didn't have an option otherwise if I wanted to virtualize them, open file limits. So every single transaction, it's in all OSs, It's in OS X and it's in Ubuntu as well. But definitely the thing that's gotten me a couple times, and Tom as well, is that open files limit. It's set and it's enforced by the operating system, and it's not the same concept that you might think it is with an open file. It's not you actually interacting with an individual file. It's the operating system, every single process that it's trying to work with MySQL or caching a communication, every single one of these things works out to be an open file. So a single transaction between a client and a server could have 10, 20, 30, 40 open files, maybe more. Once you've maxed this out, you're done. You're done. You're not getting past it unless you reboot your server or you have physical access to it and have already logged into it. In my situation, I've had it so I can't even SSH in. And once you get on the actual virtual terminal interacting with the hardware itself, it's fighting you, and you might even have to hard reboot it. So just things to keep in mind, and I'm sure that there's other examples in other operating systems, but this is definitely something that got me. It got me once and it got me again. It got me in 5.8 when I was first kind of teething on RHEL and how to use it for our JSSs, and then when I actually implemented my JSS cluster in RHEL, it was 6.4. And unbeknownst to me at the time, they had changed the way they were doing the open files. I thought it was set. It was not set, no. Production and users kindly reminded me of that once trouble tickets started coming in. Different JDKs, yeah. So that's another one that was really interesting. In RHEL, when we were playing around trying to figure out what kind of our configuration was going to be and what the end result that we wanted each one of these JSS web apps to be built, which in my scenario, I wanted them to be identical. I want you to be able to duplicate that VM 30 times and you just have to change its host name, because that's how similar they're gonna be. So I wanna make sure that this is really stable. You wanna make sure that every single one of these web apps are as close to the same thing as possible for troubleshooting reasons. If something weird starts happening, you will end up going across the board trying to figure it out. So in my scenario, I threw on, just used yum and brought down the vendor-provided Java JDK. No. So it was really weird. So the JSS would function, but anytime that we made an API call, and everything else looked fine, anytime that you made an API call, it would come back in JSON instead of XML. Really weird. Like, you'd think it was something that was actually broken and spitting out an error. No, everything seemed fine. It was just returning JSON instead of XML, which was interesting because we were testing, I believe at the time it was the upgrade path between like 8.6 and 8.7, and Tom and I are going back and forth. I'm like, what's happening? Who changed this? When did this change? Like, somebody has to tell me, because I have a lot of API scripts out there interacting with things, and now all of a sudden, all my output from my API scripts, it's in a totally different context. It's now in JSON instead of XML. Like, this is bad. How are we gonna fix this? And we went back and forth and we figured it out. And we found out that we could force it in the call, and we'd have to rewrite all of my scripts everywhere. Redeploy whatever I had to. But at the end of the day, it was the Java that was installed. Once I ripped that out and I put in the OpenJDK 6, done, fine, no problem. So just the lessons learned on that one. And definitely MySQL is still your weakest link, even in Casper 9. MySQL is still not capable of being clustered. So you make sure that you have lots of backups and that your MySQL server is really beefy. So they can handle a slave master, secondary, primary scenario with the databases, but it's really just a clone. It's not necessarily an active failover. That is something that I know that they're looking into for future releases, and it's something that's been a feature request for people for quite some time, is actually getting that fixed. Okay. Let's go. If anybody has any questions, open up for Q&A.
Run. I'm running.
I should have had you guys all sit in different corners just so we could make Tom run around.
Can you expand a little bit on the open file limits issue you ran into on Rail and what you found you had to set it to?
Yeah, no problem. I didn't have security mandating a certain configuration set on that, so I made sure that I set that ridiculously high. I think I set it to like 1 million open files, something like that. Because there's other places where you can control that. So within Tomcat, you can control how many threads it can open. You can control, in MySQL, you can control, within it as well, there's an open file limit. So you can control it there and set those lower. But I wanted to make sure that the OS itself wasn't going to get strangled out by the appliance that I was trying to run on it.
I was going to say on OS 10, if you put a boatload of RAM into an OS 10 computer, it should automatically up that number for you.
Yeah, I haven't run into the same issue in OS X. It's always a lot nicer. Rel, coming from kind of Ubuntu OS X and then having to integrate and use Rel, it's an interesting experience. You feel handcuffed a lot of times.
Have you run into any certificate issues with the clustering? Like how do the certificates work with the multiple web apps, the SSL certs, and or the Apple push certificate?
Yeah, no,
certs?
totally. Good call. Good question. The APNS cert, not an issue. That's on my side. It's not an issue. It's actually gone against it goes against the master and the managed DNS name. So any of the web apps can issue commands back and forth to APNS on that. Let's see. There we go. Yeah, so in this scenario, you want to make sure that you have a trusted jss.acme.com. And if you went through and depending on how you've configured Tomcat within the JSS, you can have it either do its own root CA authority or use an external root CA authority. Either way, yes, your clients need to trust each one of these systems. All the web apps need to have their own SSL cert generated and trusted. In my scenario, I'm using the root CA from Casper, so all the clients trust the root CA from Casper. If you wanted to go out and get GeoTrust certs or purchase certs, you'd do it that way as well. But definitely you want to make sure that the clients trust the certificate. And same will come with the JDS as well when we talk about that. All right, any other questions? Yep.
When you talked about the MySQL being the weakest link, have you tried the MariaDB at all? And if so, does that improve performance at all with Casper? I've kind of read mixed reviews on if it's actually any different other than being under the Apache license instead of owned by Oracle.
Right. So if you're going to, instead of MyISAM, and you go to the INODB, there is a difference in the table locking. Tables aren't locked, cells are locked. And if you're having a lot of high access traffic, you're supposed to get a performance increase from there. I've always seen a lot of gotchas. If you go on the internet and you Google one versus the other, you're gonna see a lot of nerd wars and people flinging ideas back and forth about how one's horrible, one's great. I have not gone down that route yet. I am very interested, and I think in my scenario, that's the next place I'm gonna have to go because I have so many clients checking in all the time, and every time they check in, every time you have to update a table, it's gonna lock that table. So you start losing performance.
Hi.
Hey, buddy.
Hey, wanted to follow up about the using the built-in CA certificate authority.
Okay.
I wanted to find out if you got any pushback from your security folks about the built-in CA. I mean, I'm using the same thing in my shop, but you know, I've heard from some other folks, oh no, can't use the built-in CA. That's, you know.
Yeah, no,
You want to use like the security folks are pushing for like a public root as opposed to like a self-signed
Right. Yeah, that's a company policy thing, and that's really has to do with security. In my situation, right now, I'm not necessarily having a problem, but we have some wildcard certs that we can apply, and so that, in my situation, the load balancer itself has a star dot, in this scenario, star.acme.com, that everybody trusts, and that is publicly trusted from whoever the issuer is. But I still use the internal root CA and use the self-signed certs for everything else internally. That is something that I'm trying to get away from, though. Definitely once you start, because I want to go down the path we're going to talk about with what kind of the stuff that the JDS can do with client certificate authentication. And once you start adding lots of different layers to this chain of trust, you want to make sure that you're not taking any backdoors on that. And then, and if you have all your clients to ignore SSL, you're opening yourself up for man-in-the-middle attacks, because even if the cert's bad, the client is going to ignore it. So why is it even there? Yeah, well, I have one more question, and then I think we can move on. Yeah.
I just have a quick question about performance when you said you had sites globally. How do you find performance with a local JSS web app hitting an international database versus just having a web app where the database is?
Okay, I follow you. So so the question is, how's performance with clients that are having to even cross across the Atlantic to get to my web app cluster, as opposed to if you're right next to the web app? There's a little bit of delay, but if you can look, and if you're interacting with your server, you can run a recon and see how much bandwidth that actually takes. It's very minimal. It is very minimal. It's just a bunch of scripts that are getting passed down to the local device. The local device is taking time to run those, and then the local device runs all the scripts that it needs to, and then just reports back the end result. You're not tying up server resources when you're doing that, and it's not a huge payload that's coming back and forth. So yes, it's a little bit slower, but it's still fine. All right, cool, thank you. That was actually an awesome QA session. You're always a little worried when you have a QA slide, because someone has to raise their hand, otherwise you just have a wasted slide in your deck. All right. So, JDS distribution server. So, this can be ran on OS X, Ubuntu, or RHEL. There are installers for all of these. There is no installer for Windows at this time. So sad. So what is it? So what is a JDS? And I think this is we were going over top questions for Jamf Nation and a lot of other people, kind of like what is the idea of what a JDS is? And we realized that in a lot of situations, people weren't on the same page. Some people thought it was the new NetSUS appliance. Some people thought that it was integrated with the NetSUS appliance. And truth is that it's completely separate right now. A JDS server is not a NetSUS. Could you make a NetSUS a JDS server? Possibly. I'd probably recommend against it. They're both pretty high-use systems. And in my environment, I did try, and I still have some success in integrating a large cluster, which I'll show you a little bit later, with SUS and a distribution point. But add NetBoot on top of that, and you're really putting a lot of eggs in one basket. So for now, separating them out, especially once you get into a lot of clients, makes a lot of sense. A JDS is just a managed system like any other client that you have. It's enrolled into the JSS. It is a managed object. It checks into the JSS. It gets its commands and its configuration from the JSS. You don't actually interact, aside from when you install the JDS, with the individual server itself. It's all controlled through the one web GUI, which is really awesome. The NetSUS, you have to go to each individual web app. It's not centrally managed. This is completely centrally managed HTTP distribution point. running off of these technologies. So same as before, so for now we have Apache, HTTP, we have OpenSSL. It's still very core open source technologies. It's not, the secret sauce is definitely the integration with Casper and everything else, but under the hood, you could do this yourself. You could configure this yourself. Enrolling it with the JSS is a different thing, but you could provide the same service. And like almost everything else in the JSS interface, it's really simple to configure it. Once you run the installer on either OS X, Ubuntu, whatever you're gonna do, it's a really step-by-step driven installer, enrolls it for you, asks you all the right questions. Once you're there, you're set up, right? And then you have these different abilities, which I can notice that you can't really read them all that well, but on the top, it's enable distribution point, enable certificate-based authentication, limit the rate in which you can download files. That's really important if you have like crappy WAN links and you don't want to strangle out all other traffic during certain times. You can change the built-in web accounts, and you can now, for the first time, choose specific files that you want to replicate. So you don't have to replicate all the files for Shanghai to Zurich. If Zurich never needs those files and Shanghai does, why does Zurich need those files? So you have that sort of granular control, which is not something we had previously. Previously, even when you did have replication with the JSS util back in 7, even then it was all or nothing. Like it was an entire rsync of that Casper share. Now it's a little bit more granular. And with Casper 9, we now have the ability to have these the in-house apps and the ebooks, right? So JDS file replication is kind of it's a little bit different than what you're used to. If you're used to just the master distribution point and you're just using AFP, because the files go through the JSS. They actually do hit the JSS and then get replicated out from there. So important points there. You gotta, where I was going with my super minimal web apps that just have enough RAM to do what they need to, more is better than less. I would rather have more servers with less specs than less servers and more specs, just because you have a higher chance for success. And if one goes down, one single one isn't that important. Whereas if you have like 2 or 3 and they're like super beefy boxes, one goes down, you're in some serious trouble because you just lost 1/3 of your ability to handle clients. But your JSS has to have enough disk space to handle your new Mavericks, Sea Lion, OS image, or the umpteenth time Adobe has updated something, and you need to repackage your new master collection. Or if you're on the Creative Cloud, I guess it's a lot smaller, I don't know. At any rate, all these files need to go through your JSS. Awesome thing, and it's from my side, and having to go through plenty of security audits through the years, I love the fact that the scripts are in the database now. That's awesome. That is awesome. For various reasons. They're in the database, which means all of your scripts, they're gonna come directly from the JSS. They don't have to come from the distribution points anymore. It's just gonna be reiterated out there. And when you're talking about shell scripts, I mean, they're not really long. They're not huge amounts of data. Unless you have something completely brilliant that's like 20 megs and 1 million lines of shell code, good luck with that. This is a really cool thing. So now, with the JDS and with JSS 9, all the scripts are going down to MySQL. So even though you uploaded them into admin, they're gonna go through the JSS into MySQL. Good takeaway on that, if you need to edit these scripts, you can only edit it from the web interface now. Once they're in the MySQL, if you need to edit these scripts, that's the only place you can edit them. Thankfully, Jamf built in a really good text editor into the UI of the JSS, so it's not as painful as if you were familiar with dealing with extension attributes previously, and you'd have no formatting, no nothing, just text that you've copied and pasted and hope that it was working correctly, and if you needed to make a change, it was a little bit more difficult. But now it's actually a good editor. So once we go through there, then all of your packages replicate out to your JDS master, parent, root server. So there's one root master JDS. It can be your master distribution point. It cannot. It doesn't matter. Either way, there will be a master JSS, JDS. It will be considered the root JDS. This root JDS will have all files all the time. All other JDSs will get their files from this JDS. So the JSS web app will only replicate to the one root JDS server. So that probably should be pretty close to your JSS web apps. It wouldn't make much sense to have them geographically across the world. Once they get onto that root, all the rest of your JDSs sync files from there. They still get their commands from the JSS that tells them what files to bring down and when to check in and do it. But now you have this ability that just because the JDS replicated JDS root went to parent A right there, parent B doesn't get its files from the JDS master. Parent B gets its files from parent A, and child A from parent A, and parent B gives files out to child B. With this selection of files where you can choose which files go where, and like I was talking about with, Zurich doesn't necessarily need all the files for Shanghai. A parent will always have all of the files regardless of if you've deselected some. So you only want, let's say for whatever reason in that scenario, Zurich was replicating its files from Shanghai. Well, in that case, Shanghai would have to have all the files regardless. Everything that Basel needed, or Zurich needed, Shanghai would need, because it has to replicate the files down to its child. So it's just something to keep in mind. Cool thing is now up in the web GUI you have this dashboard. So when you upload a file into the admin, you actually get real-time progress showing you as your file goes across your topography where it's going. And there's also actually a progress bar down on the bottom underneath each one as the file gets sent off. So you can see here that I have loaded 2 files to the root master. It has 1 file that it's already gotten from the JSS, 1 it's waiting on, and everywhere down the line they know that they're waiting on 2 files from whatever parent JDS they have. But you can see this now in real time and at least have a glance at what's going on and what situation all of your distribution points are on. So there's kind of an idea of when I was talking about this one goes to this one, this one goes to this one, this one goes to this one. This idea is kind of based around everybody's WAN link and network topography is completely different, and it doesn't have to be so crazy as different countries. It could be different cities, it could be different buildings, it could be different rooms in the same building. The idea is that you're always taking the path of least resistance, right? So in this scenario, you have SSF, which replicates out to all these, and there's 2 in each site because that's how I deploy them. I make sure that I have 2, any site that I roll out gets 2 Mac minis, if it's not a large site. So we were talking less than a few hundred clients, I don't know, 1,000 clients. I haven't run into any real problems. I make sure there's 2 out there so that if one goes down, we can still have 1 up in any site. So you have SSF, it's transferring all the files to Eau Claire, but it's not transferring directly to Toronto. Why? Oh, maybe SSF to Eau Claire, great connection. From Eau Claire to Toronto, great connection, but from SF to Toronto, not so good a connection. And why do we need to keep pushing tons of data to every site individually when we could control that and only upload it once and then let the next one replicate off the previous one, so on and so forth. So then in the end, when I'm all the way out in Europe, I don't have to replicate from San Francisco to Paris, to Tokyo, to Zurich, to Amsterdam. I can go straight to Amsterdam, replicate there, and now Amsterdam is going to replicate out from there. So we're not transferring tons of files across that bad link all the time. There's all kinds of different ways you can play with it, but this was kind of a larger scenario that I wanted to throw up there. So then this is what I have set up right now. So the one thing about the JDS appliance is it is an appliance. It's its own individual entity. So currently it cannot be clustered. So I can't have 6 JDS servers behind a load balancer, and have built-in certificate authentication working. They're not made to act that way. If they all had their own individual storage, which to me seemed like a waste, you could do that. But in my scenario, all of my VMs behind the load balancer, all their storage is actually an NFS mount, a really fast SAN that's on the network that they're right next to through 10 gigabit fiber. Like, it's fast. And I don't want to have to replicate to that 6 times just because I have 6 distribution points behind this kind of cluster. So in my situation, I have these just HTTP distribution points. All it is, it's just Apache, HTTPD, sharing out the file shares, and OpenSSL to handling certificates. And then all that storage is on the NFS storage, which when I replicate to, I actually replicate to this server that's off to the side. Very similar to kind of how I'd set up the JSS infrastructure. You have the things that people use, and then you have the thing that you use. You use a different system than everybody else uses, so you're not messing with what users need to use all the time. You're off to the side. This is the one that handles all the replication, makes sure that all the files on the NFS storage mount are the same. And yeah, clear takeaway that those are not JDSs. Originally, when I was going to come up here, I had some questions with dev and went back and forth, and this is what we came out to, is that, you know, the JDS right now that isn't a good place for it, but that doesn't mean that you can't do something similar yourself. In my scenario, I need a really beefy distribution point because I have a lot of external clients, and this is actually published externally. So all of the clients around the world that are off the network will use this infrastructure. Could I go with an Amazon S3? Totally, really would love to. It's expensive, and I haven't been able to justify the cost yet. But that's the situation. And this is also what runs SUS. So SUS is on the same file shares. You have the Casper server folder and the Reposado folder. And these, around the world, if you're off the network, you're going to this cluster to get all of your software updates. Yeah, okay. All right, key takeaways on this one. All your files, they get uploaded to the JSS and then to JDS. Make sure you have enough space on your web appliances for your largest file. So as they're replicating across, it is going to take it up. Once the file gets transferred to the root JDS, it's immediately deleted out of your, it's no longer taking up space. But you at least initially have to have room for that cache. Other thing, non-flat packaging files, you can't use them with Casper Remote or Casper Imaging anymore. For those of you that have gone through the upgrade process and may have joined up at JDS before, you saw Casper admin zipping all of those packages up. So it automatically zips all of those files, and now, at least currently, imaging and Casper Remote, you can't deploy those. All the scripts, if you need to edit them, they need to be edited from the JSS. And like we were talking about before with the root CA, the chain of trust, it has to be there. If you're going to turn on client-based authentication between the JDS and the clients have to trust the JDS. The JDS, by default, will automatically get its certificate from the signed root CA set up in Casper, though. So that's part of the enrolling process. It will get a web cert from your JSS. All right, so we're going to skip this Q&A and just do one at the end, because we're going to go over sites pretty quickly here. So, sites, they pop up everywhere. Depending on, it's the same, it doesn't have to be worldwide. It could be different buildings, different areas. But now, in Casper 9, we have this idea of sites and what sites actually are. Sites are just organizational units for administration and for policies and for reporting, okay? It's fairly easy to set up. We'll show you the checkboxes. It's another one of those things in the JSS. It's just checkboxes, but planning how you're going to do that and how you're going to separate your users is where you get kind of touchy. So sites, we use it for site-based administration. Let's say you want site A to have full control over their users, but you don't want them to impact site B and you want to still be able to force site A to do things. There's a good representation for sites. You want site A to be able to run reports, but you don't want them to get the information from site B. There you go. Sites over there in the network organization, they are not sites as defined in Active Directory. I've heard that question before. So it's not, there's no link. This is something that you're actually just setting up logical units yourself in your JSS. Setting up display names. And then more importantly, then you get down to actually the administrative users. As soon as you have sites turned on, you get another pop-down in any of your user account fields, whether or not it's an LDAP group or whatever, logical group of local accounts. You now can determine whether or not this is a site admin or a full access. And the difference here, this is just for an example. Down here you have site admin 1 logged in. He only sees one policy. He sees the site 1 policy. He doesn't see update inventory. That's a global policy. That's the full access policy. He doesn't see the site 2 policy. All he sees is the site 1 policy. He can make his own policies, but they can only be applied to the site 1 computers. However, on the top, you have the full admin, the JSS admin right there, and that admin can see everything, including site 1, site 2, everything down the line. Same thing with computers. Site 1 admin will only see site 1's computers, won't see site 2, so on and so forth. So, key takeaways, they're here to control your views for your admins and for your users, and to help delegate responsibilities if you want to. Maybe you have a site that wants to have a heavy hand in making sure that Chrome doesn't auto-update, and every single interim rev that Chrome goes to, they want to make a package and deploy a policy, and that's just not what you're about. Like, you don't have time for that. You want to empower your site to be able to take care of their local needs, but you don't want to have to be the one to do that. You can do that. And not be worried about them affecting anyone else, because they can't. All they can affect is their little piece of the world. And only the JSS administrator the full access admin, can assign these sites. So they can't just put computers in their site without having some sort of help from the actual overall admin. Easy setup, very powerful. Think about it for a while of how you're going to do it and whether or not it actually works for you. All right, do we have time for QA here?
11 minutes.
Perfect.
For load balancing, you've mentioned load balancing in a couple of areas. Do you have a preferred vendor, or do you have a magical virtual appliance that does load balancing or something like that?
I do not. I'm sure they exist, the magical virtual appliance that you could set up for that. We use F5s, pretty big ones.
Right. And my other question is, so with the JDS, you're uploading packages through the JSS. How long do they stay in the JSS? Or like they immediately, after they hit the JDS, they automatically purged from the JSS? How long do they stay in the JSS as they're making their way to the JDS?
Yeah, after the file's been confirmed that it's on the root JDS, they're deleted out of the JSS and MySQL.
That was my questions.
How much RAM do you have in your database server?
16 gigs.
Okay, and then second question, on the packages, do they ever hit the SQL database?
So the answer to that is yes. Thank you. Yes, they do hit the MySQL database. So you need to make sure that there's enough room there as well.
While he's walking through that, pretty loud voice. So sites not applicable to packages. So if we have multiple sites, they have their own purchasing agreements, However, Site 2 admin may be able to see Site 1's Adobe Creative Suite. Couldn't any,
That's a feature request?
So yes, you're correct that he would, any admin, what the question was, since they can't record it unless it's reiterated, if you had Site 1 admin that had their own purchasing agreements for the way that they were getting software packages, and then you had a Site 2 admin and they had their own purchasing agreements, would they be able to assign packages from each other? And the answer right now is yes, because sites do not affect packages at this time. You could control on your level what files were replicated down to their JDS, so it's possible they'd never actually be able to successfully deploy those files, but they're still gonna see them, and they'll be able to add them to a policy right now.
On the syncing, I think you might have answered the question, but used the appliances or web apps. So when you do the syncing through the JSS, does it pick the main JSS? I was bitten by a WinClone image, and I'm just curious if it could go to any of those or if it would travel through the main.
So it's gonna go up to the cluster.
Yeah.
So in my scenario, it's gonna go up to the cluster because that's what all of the individual applications, like if you open up Casper Remote, you don't go to the master, and even if you do, it's gonna switch you back to the managed URL. So you'll be interacting with one server in that cluster. You're not necessarily gonna be able to choose which one.
And second really quick question, and you might not, but is anyone using Gluster file system? If they are, I'd like to chat with them. Rels, Gluster.
Yeah, so definitely find him later on if you're using a clustered file system.
Gluster,
Gluster? Okay. Cool.
So I have a quick question on the sites and their inability to do the Casper or the packages to be baffled, if you will. Is there a way to work around that with Casper events or the API events to separate that out a little bit, or is it a feature request that's being considered, or
It's a
anything along
feature
those
request.
lines?
I don't know if it's up right now. I definitely say everyone should put it up there. If you want it as a feature, vote it up. The events API, that would be a question for dev and for your support person. My personal opinion, I don't think that's gonna help you. I could be completely wrong because you can do some awesome things with the API.
Regarding sites, I was wondering, is it possible for either a user account or a group account to be an administrator of multiple sites?
No. No. You can only be an administrator of one site or all sites.
And then
Good question, though. I thought I tried to figure that out, too. Because it's like, wait, what if I want to be site 1 and site 2, but not site 3? You can't do that. With groups, you could? I apologize, and that's why we have Jamf in the obvious.
All right, that's great. And a real quick follow-up as far as distribution points versus JDS, is there really any need for a distribution point anymore, a master?
No, a JDS is a distribution point. It's just an appliance. So you would not need anything other than that. If you had all JDSs in your environment, you'd be fine. It can act as your master distribution point. And I think we got time for one more question.
We got 5 minutes.
Okay, cool.
So for a lot of environments, a significant performance pain point is the amount of time it takes to enroll, especially if you're in K-12, and it's like, everybody go now. And then, oh, I need to push out a profile to 10,000 devices. So in a clustered environment, how can I increase that performance?
So in a clustered environment, enrolling, it's gonna help in enrolling, but it's only gonna help as fast as it can talk, as fast as the web clients can talk to MySQL. The faster you can make MySQL, whether or not it's giving them more RAM, optimizing what you're keeping in there, getting, maybe your user, it's big, it's bloated, that's gonna be your weakest link, but the cluster is absolutely gonna help you. As far as the APNS pushes, every server, Originally, it was actually my understanding that only the master was the one that actually sent out APNS pushes, but that's not the case. It's all web apps do it all the time. So you will have a balance across all the web apps on which one's going to be issuing those policies, those profiles. However, you're still limited to how quickly you can interact with APNS and how much you already have in your queue waiting to be done. Whether you have maybe, in my situation, I have smart groups based off of network segments, and depending on which network segment you're in, and if you're moving around a lot, you'll get a different sus server based on that. So that can, configurations like that can queue up a big chunk. And the JSS checks for its queue of things to communicate out to APNS every 5 minutes. So even if you do it immediately, it's going to take at least 5 minutes before it starts iterating through its queue.
Question related to the package upload in JDS.
Yeah.
So are you using the installer from Jamf, or are you using kind of like the self, just here's the Tomcat War?
Right. No, on my side, for JDSs, I'm using the actual installer from Jamf.
Are you, how much space do you think is necessary to have? Because our initial layout was to have things on different partitions than user local.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to figure out how to relay out my file system now.
No, I follow you. So you can use symlinks with the JDS. I mean, initially, it's going to install everything in one place, but you can then symlink that out to other file shares, other hard drives, other volumes, however you want to do it at that point. And that question is really, how many files do you have? How large do you need it to be? In my environment, I've made sure everything's able to do up to 1 terabyte. Still, to date, we've been using it for years now, and I'm only using about 300 gigs of space. And even that's kind of bloated. Like, there's still a lot of old Adobe packages in there. But it's completely up to you and how you are using the Casper suite. And that's my favorite thing about the whole software solution. There is no right answer of how to use it. It's what works best for you and your environment.
One last quick question.
So have you looked at changing the MySQL table types to improve performance, going to InnoDB to speed writes?
Yeah, I think we talked about that a little bit. I'm investigating that, and I hear that it's good things. I have also heard that it's not something trivial. So it's definitely I'm going to start testing against. But talk with your Jamf rep.
Okay, we're out of time. Thanks everybody for coming.